Hi, bonjour, welcome and bienvenue. My name is Savannah Boylan, and on behalf of the Canadian Consulates General in Miami and Atlanta, I would like to welcome you to the first conversation of the Climate Change and Environmental Justice event series, which focuses on communities in Canada and the United States Southeast. In fact, today's discussion is very timely, given that Sunday marks the start of the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, which is being organized by the UK and Italy, and which will take place in Glasgow through November 12th. COP26 will bring together signatories of the Paris Agreement to work together on climate action through more ambitious targets and plans to accelerate the global shift to clean energy, clean technology, and clean growth. The science is clear. Existing efforts are not enough to avoid catastrophic climate change, and climate change disproportionately impacts minority and Indigenous communities. As neighbors and as trusted partners, Canada and the United States have much to share as we strive to advance climate ambitions in North America, and as we look to build back better in the wake of COVID-19. These commitments are reflected in the roadmap for a renewed US-Canada partnership that was signed by President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau in February of this year. So it is in that spirit that we set out to connect experts in Canada and the Southeast US to share views on what needs to be done to counteract and combat climate change and to achieve environmental equity. I would like to acknowledge and thank our distinguished panel of speakers for their amazing leadership in this work, and who will be introduced by our moderator, Dr. Tina Liu, in just a few moments. I know that all of our experts have a wealth of information to share with you, and I hope today's event will help lay the groundwork for future and expanded cross-border collaboration and our shared efforts towards environmental justice. Finally, I would like to thank the Coasts, Climates, the Humanities, and the Environment Consortium, and the University of Georgia's Institute of Native American Studies for their partnership in this event series. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the conversation to our moderator, Dr. Tina Liu. Tina?
Thanks, Savannah, and thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this panel. My name is Tina Liu, and I come to you from the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. I teach history, environmental history, at the University of British Columbia, and certainly part of my teaching involves teaching fundamentally about environmental justice. And being located in Vancouver, British Columbia means that the impacts of climate change on the coast are certainly top of mind and increasingly visible. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation amongst people who are directly engaged in grappling with these questions. And I'm going to moderate. We're going to have a conversation for about a little over half an hour, and then we'll have a bit of time for some Q&A. And maybe I'll just end and then turn it over to whoever wants to go first by just saying how the impacts of climate change on the coast kind of creep into my everyday in increasing ways. I cycle to work every day, and over the years, I've traveled along the water's edge. And in the last 5 years, the city has had to start to sandbag parts of the bike path because the king tides, which we get every year, have increasingly been dangerous in terms of eroding that bike path because of the larger number of storms we've had and the storm surges, which push that water inland and start to flood out, not just the path, but the properties adjoining. So people are becoming aware in a very kind of basic way about the impacts of climate change. This is a bike path and a bicycle commute. Certainly, I can adjust to this, but other people are not in the position of adjusting. And that's where we can talk about environmental justice. So I will introduce our panelists. They are Natalia Brown from Catalyst Miami. She's the Climate Justice Program manager, and certainly we know about Miami and climate change, rising sea levels. We have Dr. Kelsey Leonard, who's a water scientist, legal scholar, policy expert, writer, and an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. And she's an assistant professor in the Faculty of the Environment at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. And we have Jeff Curry, member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, a Lumbee River keeper and part of the Winya Rivers Alliance. And I'm very pleased to learn from all of them today about their perspectives on environmental justice, coasts, and climate change. So I'll turn it over to the panelists. We didn't really talk about who wanted to get started, but so feel free to jump in, somebody, and we can go from there and just have a conversation. Or I'll call on people just like I do in class.
I can start us off. It would be my pleasure. Don't want to get called on. But to give a little bit of an introduction of where I'm coming from, Catalyst Miami is an economic justice organization. We're based, as was mentioned, in Miami-Dade County, which of course is a often noted coastal community that is certainly impacted by the climate crisis in many different ways. And as an economic justice organization, we've also become a very strong movement partner and advocate for climate justice. And that's because the ways that climate change is impacting residents of the low wealth communities and communities of color that we work most closely with, that we work collectively with to identify and address problems. The climate crisis is so deeply intersectional and so relevant to all of the economic and public health and housing and energy related hardships that they're facing and that are most immediate and profound in their lives. So I can start us with that.
Thanks. Maybe each of you want to talk about your connection to these questions that we're talking about today, just as Natalia did. That would be great. Jeff, do you want to go? Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah,
there you
technology. As Lumbee River Keeper, or as we say, Lumbee River Keeper, and being the river keeper in my own community, you know, my job is about water quality first off, but water quality, as I say a lot when I talk in the community and other places, is water quality, and the health of the river is also the health of the people in the community. So it's intertwined, it's interconnected. So if the river's not healthy, the waterways, then the community's not healthy. And as is different than other places, but you know, my watershed, because we do have Lumbee tribe as well as other Native peoples from other areas in the watershed. You know, Robinson County, which is the primary county, is 40% Indian. 25% African American, 10% Latinx, and other counties in the watershed are comparable in some of the areas. And so economic and environmental justice is key. And part of what we've been going through in the past few years are the aftermath of two extreme, what some call 500 to 1,000 year hurricanes, Hurricane Matthew and Florence in 2016, 2018, and trying to, you know, put some perspective on it and understand what is happening globally on the ground here locally, and deal with, try to get the word out and have a lot of more education, understanding, and put some action to it of how to go forward. Because as I say a lot, and a lot of people tell me, this isn't the end. It's going to continue being like this. And as it continues, it's going to get worse. We don't get 2-inch rainstorms anymore. We get 9-inch rainstorms. And so climate change is real. and because we are in, you know, the river was our protector. It's allowed us to survive through colonialism for hundreds of years because it was very swampy around it. But right now, that swamp environment is also what's flooding us. You know, the river and being in this area is one of the things that, you know, is impacting us with all of climate change. So, you know, just having to survive that it's been tough, and you know, look forward to more conversation about that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Kelsey, for north of the 49th parallel.
Yes, well, Akwe, hello. It's wonderful to be with you all today. So I am, as was mentioned in my bio, a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation, which is located on the east end of what's currently known as Long Island, New York. So I'm a sort of Northeast Atlantic Indigenous person. So good to be in conversation with our Southern relatives, and thank you to Jeff and Lumbee people for their stewardship. I'm also zooming in today from Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory in southwestern Ontario. So what I can say about all those different geographies is that we are sharing in our experience of climate stress and of the climate crisis in the context of our seascapes, our waterscapes, and that coastal experience. And I can say that with confidence because of the injustices that keep recurring. Jeff spoke to some of them, Natalia spoke as well to them, and I know of them in my own personal experience as a Shinnecock person. And I think where these injustices center is around a conversation that we have to have at local, regional, national, and international scales around what does justice mean and who is justice for. And I often say that it is our notions of justice in the context of the climate crisis and planetary health need to be reimagined or reclaimed from an Indigenous perspective to really center the needs of the environment above the needs of humans. So right now we have a justice system, a conceptualization of justice that is anthropocentric, that centers the needs of humans. And that is important because we still have very many human rights that have gone unanswered and that have been suppressed and oppressed. But we also have the rights, the inherent rights of nature itself, the inherent rights of the water, the inherent rights of the river, the inherent rights of the ocean that are not being recognized or fulfilled in terms of our responsibilities as humans to those living entities. And so I think that's a part of what our conversation today is looking at. And it's about understanding those shared commonalities. Oftentimes in the Western world, water is positioned as a barrier, as a boundary maker, rather than actually a connector. And I think for a lot of our Indigenous communities, speaking as a Shinnecock woman, but in conversation with other Indigenous peoples, we see water as that connector. We see water as a part of us and we being a part of that water. As Jeff said earlier, the river's health is our health. And so I think if we start to have that framing more broadly articulated and accepted in international conservation practice, we would be better off in terms of planetary health moving forward.
Thanks. Those are big questions that Kelsey raises. You know, how do we reconceptualize notions of justice to be inclusive of non-human nature, right? That's part of it. Natalia, do you have any sense, working in a very urban environment, about the kinds of challenges and questions that Kelsey raised about what's justice and who's justice for, and how your organization has been working on those questions in specific contexts? Maybe give a sense of what you guys have been up to and engaging such issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so much of what you described and you opened us up to really resonates with some of the work that we're seeing and building towards on the ground. And something that comes to mind is really just the need and the ongoing efforts by residents, by communities at large, to live in right relationship with the non-human environment, and just the continued intrusion and the continued just forcible intervention by other corporate interests, by foreign investors we're seeing in Miami-Dade County, and just by encroaching development that is really seeking to manipulate and to fashion the way that our human society is structured, and that relationship that we have with the non-human environment in a way that ultimately comes back to those climate impacts on the people and the places that we all love. Because those same marginalizing and exploitative practices that are harming the land, that are exploiting our labor, are the same practices that are then displacing residents or disproportionately exposing them to extreme heat. So we see so many parallels and so many feedback loops in the ways that we are both responding to climate impacts, and then the opportunities and really necessary areas that we have to focus on to be able to meaningfully address the challenges posed by climate change.
Yeah, thanks. Jeff, what about
Yeah.
you? What challenges do you see in achieving what Kelsey spelled out?
The challenges we're facing here, I mean, in Eastern North Carolina specifically, there are a lot of Native communities. We've all dealing with the hurricanes I mentioned. You know, my friend, fellow tribal member and colleague Ryan Emanuel pointed out very succinctly that when the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was coming down the East Coast of North Carolina, that it disproportionately was coming through Native communities. And that puts a disproportionate burden on these communities, on other communities of color that it was coming through as well, and having to deal with the impacts of that, some of which are dangerous, the pollution, but also every pipeline cuts through the wetlands. It destroys wetlands and increases flooding. It also contributes to more climate change because of the gas, because of the cutting of trees. And we've got to rethink our energy policies, number one. I mean, and get government under control, get businesses under control to what the will of the people is and the needs, but also what's healthy for the people and for communities. I mean, we also, you know, one of the other challenges we're dealing with is we have lots of chickens and hogs, CAFOs, in my watershed and others in southeastern North Carolina, and we've seen the biggest growth in poultry CAFOs in the last couple of years of anywhere in North Carolina. And one of the issues from that is they, in addition to the runoff that pollutes the water, that messes with drinking water, that makes it harder to filter, harder to clean, impacts human health, impacts our environment and our communities' homeland. And what I consider, the environment is, these are our cousins, they are us. It also has led to the growth of biogas. So now they want to put down more pipelines, cut through more of our wetlands, cross more of our land, and then pipe that gas to facilities that burn to create electricity, and at the same time they lie to us. So I mean, we've got to get it under control. They need to start respecting our sovereignty. They need to start respecting where we're at, our position, and what's going on, and understanding what they're doing that impacts not just our community, but globally, what these impacts are having. So I think there's a lot of challenges that we're dealing with. And it just, I think one of the good things is having this conversation so that people from different communities could see what's happening in other places. And then, having other people understand what's happening in these communities really can generate more dialogue and hopefully help people work together, because we need help. I know other folks need help. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, all of you, for the challenges are huge. I guess I'd like to talk about what steps your organizations, your communities have taken to mitigate, to adapt to, if that's the right word, the changing climate, and to get the changes that you want to see. Natalia, do you want to talk about what Catalyst has done in certain cases to start answering these challenges?
Happy to share a bit. Definitely being in a coastal community, most of us have come to intimately know that adaptation really isn't an option. Often being adaptive and responding to these changes has been something that that residents and as community-based organizations we have to navigate. It's something that it's just become necessary at this point. At the same time, though, understanding that this is a more structural, it's a systems level problem, and it's something that we cannot afford to continue bearing the burden of having to adapt to and being reactive in a way that is also burdensome and extractive on people and places that that we rely on and that we're in community with. I think that we've sought to identify different leverage points within this system and try to, at the same time as we are focusing on adaptation, on addressing immediate needs of residents and communities when it comes to, I mean, like Jeff was saying, I think another thing that really requires more focus and perhaps reconceptualization is the idea of health. And what does a community, a person really need to just fundamentally be able to live a healthy and secure life? Because so many of the harms that we're seeing that we need to be, yes, adapting to, but mitigating at the root cause, they inhibit our ability to, whether as individuals or collectively, just lead healthy lives. And so Catalyst Miami we have so many different programs that try to address all of these things through different strategies, right? But broadly under the umbrella of building power in the historically Black, migrant communities, low wealth communities, and other communities of color throughout Miami-Dade County that historically have been barred from fair participation in both the economy and in government. Usually at the municipal level. And so we have a side of the organization that's focused on community economic development. We recently started a project that is a real estate investment cooperative where we're seeking to really increase the security and stability and local economic benefits of being an entrepreneur. And also embedding just culture and community in that relevance of what services are accessible to you and are able and that you're able to lean on to meet your needs. We also have a lot of support for small businesses and for just general workforce development to learn more and start and get support for a worker-owned enterprise. And then on my side of the organization, we focus a lot on community engagement and policy and advocacy at the city, county, and state level primarily to really move forward the priorities that the residents that we call our neighbors, that are our colleagues, that we work in partnership with in this movement to try and make the most of those leverage points, right, in this system that can move us towards addressing those immediate concerns, but also these more structural harms.
Yeah. What strikes me from what you've said is that the point of pushback is local. That's where you started, local community development, engaging the local to start addressing, whether it's through setting up development corporations or other things, to start addressing these larger structural changes. And I'm wondering if Kelsey or Jeff, you want to talk about the scale of engagement and whether you see local as the place to begin and the most effective place to begin, and what local things you've done, if indeed you've done local is your target.
Well, thought I'd just maybe interject on a few ideas, and then happy to turn it over to Jeff. This is a Canada-US exchange and conversation. And I think as we think about the Southeast, I think Canadians should recognize that they also have a responsibility to the Southeast in two ways. And a responsibility largely to this conversation about the climate crisis and about Indigenous peoples and pipeline proliferation. So the first is that a significant amount of Canadian extractive industries are proliferating pipelines through Indigenous communities in the United States. We have active line defenses right now against Line 3 and Line 5. Jeff has spoken to what his own community went through, not a Canadian company, but maybe with Canadian subsidiaries or connections. And so the way in which pipeline proliferation and fossil fuel extraction is continuing throughout North America is something that we all, as concerned global citizens, need to be more conscious of and less complicit in. And so that is looking at your pension funds, that's looking at the financial trail that you're connected to in supporting these industries. That's one. The second is that a lot of Canadians of certain sectors snowbird in the Southeast. And when we talk about justice in the context of, when we talk about justice broadly in the context of whether it's to benefit of humans or to benefit of nature, we have a responsibility not just to be the bearers of disproportionate benefits of pristine nature, pristine environments, or even climate buyouts in the context of the different types of climate stressors that are being seen in the Southeast. You own your second home there. What have you done to give back to the Southeast, to that environment, and to those communities? And I don't think we're hearing enough of that conversation of, being sort of, claimed American now living in Canada and being, at an institution and professorial role. I think Canadians are seen on the global scale as being, really nice, lovely people, and they are, but they, I think, also are kind of left to be given the benefit of the doubt, maybe too often than they should. And when I say that is to say you have a culpability if you go and snowbird somewhere for your winters to give back to that community, to give back to the residents who don't just live there seasonally, but have to deal with the hurricanes because of your excessive flying and the emissions of that air traffic. So it's all connected, and I just wish we thought more about the justice implications of those who bear the disproportionate burdens in comparison to those who bear the disproportionate benefits and your second homes.
That just resonates with me so much with my experience in teaching, because one of the main things that comes through in teaching global environmental history is that it's the erasure of those connections that is at the bottom of a lot of harm that happens. So you've talked about those transnational connections and how when they are invisible, we cease to see our own, how we're implicated in them. Exactly right. But when Jeff was talking earlier, he kept referring, Jeff, I was so struck by you talking about my watershed, the watershed that I live in. And often I will ask my students that exact question: where does your water come from? Do you know what watershed you live in? What happens, what happens when you flip the switch in the room? So it's not just the transnational connections, it's even local connections that need to be highlighted. And different people are differently situated. And it's a measure of privilege that some of us can live with the erasures that we don't need to know. But for people of color, for Indigenous people who are on the front lines of this, there isn't that privilege. So I wonder, Jeff, if you want to talk about some of the things that Kelsey and Natalia talked about what your community has done to push back, specific projects or initiatives you've undertaken.
Yeah, I can do that. I first would like to say yes, what you're saying, Kelsey, about people need to recognize, snowbirds from Canada coming south. I often say the same thing about even North Carolinians who live in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, or Charlotte coming east to go to the coast, to go to the beach for a vacation, and the only time they ever come to Eastern North Carolina is to stop and get gas on the way. They have no concern about us at all. And it's like we don't exist, and they need to, really to step up and understand the impacts they're having. But yes, locally, one of the things, and I'm thankfully in an active place that's had a long history of environmental justice work, with a lot of local organizations across all across the lines, from Native as well as most of the Black community in the past. And so, right now we're working on something with a local partner called Robeson County Cooperative for Sustainable Development. And we're looking at talking to communities finally, because no one's doing that, about the impacts that climate change is having on their day-to-day life, to understand what's going on. But also, working with other groups, even inside and outside. And in the case of, we have a lot of proliferation of what's called pellet plants, wood pellet industry in North Carolina right now. And we have a pellet plant that's been going, trying to be built in my watershed. And so we've got people together and organize to try to combat that, because what is happening with that is they're cutting down trees in North Carolina to ship the pellets and making these pellets, which is an air quality and water quality concern, and shipping it overseas to Europe so they can burn it for electricity. And that makes no sense. Why cut down our trees so they can have lights? That doesn't make any sense to me. They got their own trees. If they want to do that to ruin their environment and to contribute to global climate crisis, they can do that on their own, but don't cut down our trees and out of our community. So we're fighting back against that. And, we find sometimes these companies do things they shouldn't. And, at one point, we're currently involved in a lawsuit with one to try to force them to get wastewater treatment permits and to do what's right by the community, because sometimes it's really hard to get some wins. It's a struggle, it's a constant battle, and I think locally one thing people could do is just be aware. Number two, know who your elected representatives are and don't expect them to know what's going on, because a lot of times they don't. And then find out who's, elected in your area and talk to them about it, for state or federal, because they need to hear from impacted communities. Because what they often say is, well, we don't hear from those folks, so we assume things are fine. Or if they don't come out and share their voice and their concerns, then we don't know. So we can't give them an excuse to not know. We have to organize locally. We have to get that voice out to our local communities, but also state, national, federal, and global, so that people know what's going on. Because we are doing a lot of work, but it's hard. It's hard to do everything. So we need to talk to each other across lines too. A lot of times we compartmentalize and get really hyper focused on where we're at, but not knowing that if we just talk to folks across these lines here and here, we could actually have a broader voice and reach to address these issues up the chain, political as well as corporate. So there's a lot of things you can do. I think that it does take time. It takes energy. It takes blood, sweat, and tears, and that's why people don't do it. So, but maybe this is a call to do that. Going forward.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it fits perfectly with connections. So in addition to seeing connections among connections in our own impacts and how we're implicated in them, what you said, Jeff, it points us to the importance of alliances, right? Alliances to make change. And maybe I wonder if Natalia and Kelsey, you want to talk about what Jeff raised, that you can't do it alone, that alliances are important, and your own experiences with that.
I'd love to share a little bit. I'm glad we're coming to this because the collective nature and the idea of care and relationships in how we're responding to climate change is so central to my work and how I believe that our communities are sustained in doing this work. So much of what I do day to day is in partnerships, it's in networks, it's in coalitions with others. And it is not only in that way, deeply building on others' strengths and identifying how we can move forward in tackling some of these really difficult, really large questions sometimes. But it's also about doing so from a perspective that has a meaningful appreciation for like the really deep intersectionality of so many of these different problems. Just feel that a lot of my work I feel is so inspired by and building off of the knowledge and expertise of Black and Indigenous feminist frameworks and the scholars and the activists that throughout history and continue to really develop ways that we can work in community, that we can build. You often hear the term resilience when we're responding to climate change in reference to investments, in reference to what have you, they'll slap resilience on it. But really, what does it mean to build a resilient community? Because most often when you go to these communities, to these people in these places that are most impacted by climate change and all of the related harms, they don't want to hear you talk about resilience. We're tired of hearing that, quite frankly. And what would it really mean to build resilience in a way that is networked and that is deep and that is centered in the needs of the human and non-human environment for us to be able to, again, live lives that are just healthy, where people can thrive without those structural harms and barriers. And so, yeah, I think having your people, your circles, and being able to collectivize around these challenges could not be more essential in my work.
Kelsey?
Yes, alliances. They are needed across scales and geographies, as we're talking today in the context of Canada and the US. I'll give sort of one example in my current work. This is a conversation around coasts and climate action. And so we are seeing increasing threats due to sea level rise and issues around ocean acidification as well, that will also make some of the storm threats that Jeff mentioned earlier be exacerbated and even potentially more frequent. So again, water is connecting us all, that hydrologic cycle is connecting us all in our experiences of these climate hazards. And so one of the areas of research that I've been working on in the past year is thinking about how do we adapt, how do we build adaptation efforts that are responsive to communities? Because right now, the adaptation efforts and planning frameworks that are currently put forward from federal agencies to even scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are very generic, and they're designed from a Western framework. And I use the term designed very loosely because when we think about science communication, and when we think about science communication enabling behavior change of everyday citizens want to look at something that inspires them. They don't want to look at something that looks like it's a pencil drawing done by a 5-year-old. And no ragging on 5-year-olds. I actually think they probably could do a better job than some of the generic designs that are out there for adaptation planning. And so some of my research in the past year or more than a year has been looking at how do we create responsive adaptation frameworks that are culturally, unique and a cultural match for, in the work that I do, predominantly Indigenous peoples. But I could imagine, as other scholars have alluded to, like Marino and Hardy, that we should be having adaptation frameworks out there in the world that are localized, context specific, and responsive to the design ideas of communities. I think there should be, a Miami-Dade adaptation framework that is responsive to the unique artistry of that community, because art is a big part of how we communicate science and inspire and enable behavior change. So the framework that we came up with for working with tribes in the Northeast was called the Wampum Framework. And a principle, it stands for witness, acknowledge, mend, protect, unite, and move. A lot of the existing adaptation frameworks, they use a generic frame called PARA, which is protect, attack, retreat, and accommodate. And accommodate actually might be the first day and attack be the last. But you can even hear in that it's a little bit of militarized language, not very accessible to the everyday citizen. So that's the challenge that we have in these generic frameworks, getting to localized context specific frameworks. And as I highlighted in the Wampum framework, one of the principles is unite. And that gets to your original question. Do we need alliances? Yes. As Indigenous peoples and tribes already on the front lines of climate change and dealing with sea level rise, we need to scale up resources amongst ourselves. So we often are uniting and learning together through best practices, but we also need to do that in collaboration with local municipalities, with states, with provinces in the context of Canada, and be able to learn and work together for our shared sustainable path forward. I don't see that happening just yet, but I think for so long, our Indigenous science and knowledge has been suppressed either violently or through legislative means. And we're now seeing an opportunity where those systemic erasures, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Liu, and that systemic environmental racism is being broken down. And we're now finally getting to a place where we can have these open and more honest conversations. And I'm just hopeful that those will continue.
Thanks. We're running out of time, but I want to ask each of you one last question before we turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. And it's going to bounce off what Kelsey just said, the last sentence, and that's about hope. What gives you hope? Where do you find it to do the work that you do? Because as Jeff said, you don't get a lot of wins. This is hard. And Kelsey said that it's important for people to be inspired, but it's also important for those of you who are working at achieving environmental justice for your communities to maintain hope. So I'd just like to know where that hope comes from each of you personally, and then we'll turn it over.
Well, I can start and then share it over to others, because I think mine is short. It's young people, it's youth climate activists who are out on the front lines and in a lot of ways giving up their youth to protect the planet. And if they can give of themselves that much, as many of them are doing, one youth in particular is very inspiring to me. Her name is Autumn Peltier. She's from Musqueam First Nation. She's the Anishinaabe Nation water commissioner, the youngest water commissioner in their history at 16. She's actually on her way, I think, to Europe right now for COP26. And I think if these young people can dedicate so much of their lives to making the planet better, so can we.
Thanks.
I would say yes to that. Yes, youth is number one. I would also say that there, some it comes from community, honestly. Out of friends, family, but certain people are doing things, and I see that they're still pushing, and they are still making change, affecting the lives of youth. People like Ryan I mentioned earlier, but also tribal member Reggie Brewer, who works for the Tribe Boys and Girls Clubs, and and is there every day to help push help to teach and to educate and to be there as a shoulder and for our community youth. And that gives me hope. It also gives me hope whenever I was at an event yesterday about environmental justice. In 30 years since the People of Color Environmental Justice Committee was first held, and we had folks from a local town, and people got together and we're talking about, what can we do to help flooding right here, right now. That gives me hope that people still come together and are pushing and are looking for change. It is hard. I agree that resiliency, I still don't know what it means other than rebound, and I'm not a rubber band. So I want something more than that. And the only way you can do that is get in a community. So I think, number one, my hope comes from that, from getting into the community and working with community and having community members come out, and youth, older, but work hard at this and give me energy. So that's kind of where I get it from.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. Definitely in so many different ways, watching and being in solidarity with communities and workers and youth activists who are sacrificing so much absolutely gives me hope, gives me strength, and also being in community with just workers and just residents, ordinary people who are really just finding empowerment in information, in connection, and just channeling the people's agency in that way absolutely also brings me hope. One other thing I thought of is storytelling. Definitely for myself, kind of that reflection, that contextualization brings me a lot of hope. It brings me a lot of clarity, helps me to see more clearly like the state of play and how our vision that we're building towards really fits into this moment right now. And I also feel like there is such a wealth to learn from when we think about past generations and what is our narrative right now, because there is so much power in the story that we tell about ourselves and that we tell about one another. And so just the act of storytelling and the cultural significance of that for many of our frontline communities really brings me hope as well, and a lot of energy for this work as well.
Well, thanks so much, all of you. We've got a bit of time for some questions, and Dave, I can see that you're there. Are the questions going to come through the chat or the Q&A? I kind of fell down on my moderator duties and forgot to ask that initially. Anybody in the audience wants to try asking a question? There's something in the chat through the Q&A. Okay, so those of you in the studio audience out there, if you put your questions into the Q&A, I think that we'll all be able to see them. I will be able to see them for sure. So don't be shy. And while we're waiting, if any of you have questions for each other, since we're talking about alliances, go ahead and ask each other anything that you've been wondering, or just a response to anything anyone's been said.
I can ask one. And Natalia, I don't know if this is centered on your work, but we saw the horrific collapse of the housing building in your area this year, and I think the findings may still be outstanding, but some have linked it to climate change and to subsidence and future threats of that in the context of sea level rise. Are you hearing anything on the ground, or has it bolstered? Sometimes being a political scientist, we hear that can be a policy shock or a window that ignites change, and I'm curious if that's happened.
Absolutely. I think it has definitely stuck on a window, but you said shock before, I believe. I think I think in some instances it has definitely provided a window, but it's still very immediate. Just the outcomes of that event and the negligence and kind of that repercussion, it absolutely shocked many of our public officials and of course just residents and community-based organizations. I'll say that the standards for construction definitely were given a much closer eye, both in Miami-Dade County, at the city of Miami, to my understanding, and also further out in South Florida in both Broward County, Palm Beach County. I can't guarantee if in Monroe County, but it absolutely heightened attention on, the resilience, if you will, of our buildings and their ability to bounce back like that rubber band when we're seeing, flooding from whether it's, rainstorms or it's just the chronic sort of long-term stressor of sea level rise, or the episodes of sunny day flooding that we're seeing, king tides, all of these different types of events that are just wearing out our buildings and coastal communities. That infrastructure ultimately was not built for this accelerating change in our climate. And so absolutely, and it's unsettling, honestly, to see how so much harm has to be caused for just a little bit of attention to be given. And like you said, sometimes that's kind of the nature of politics and how public responses are to climate impacts. But I would say yes, in short, yes, it has acted in both ways.
Well, we've got a question, and maybe this will be the question for all of you to take a shot at before I turn things back over to Savannah. It's from Claudio Sant, and he says that there are large-scale economic forces at play in climate change, and he wants to know how you see the relationship between local and community activism and the immense power of transnational corporations. So that relationship and you want to comment? Any of you can comment on that.
I mean, I would say it's a long haul fight. Jeff made a nod to that earlier with the work of Ryan Emanuel and others from the Lumbee tribe and other tribes in North Carolina in the context of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I think you don't go into fighting major pipeline corporations thinking that you're going to have an outright win. It is a war. It is a series of long-standing, battles that you go in, and some you win and some you lose. I think we've seen a transition after the Dakota Access Pipeline sort of standoff and occupation at Standing Rock. But they're still fighting that in court. There are still losses and there are wins, and it is a lifetime battle that I think, to what Natalia said earlier, I just wish people didn't have to fight to begin with, because so many lives are lost. Even LaDonna Allard, and her husband both passed away after fighting against that, and still passed away with there still being oil running through Standing Rock. And so it's disheartening that so many communities are being severely impacted in this way. But I will say that there are still folks, despite all of that, that are willing to put their bodies on the line. So if you're interested, go to the Line 3 Defense website and put your money where your mouth is.
Maybe that's, Jeff, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would. I think that there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different kinds of activism. For instance, we have an LNG that's been built in our watershed by Duke Energy, and basically they were allowed to do it without an air permit. Minimal permitting. It was easier to do that than build a bridge. And it's got 1.6 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas. They're going to use it likely to help out the biogas industry as a point of cleaning and storing gas and putting it out where they need it. And what they did before they even announced is they started meeting with communities and volunteer fire departments and schools and churches and the university and the community college. They started handing out grants. And they granted people 50,000 here, 150 there, 250 every year. They greased the wheels to make it happen so that they wouldn't get community pushback. You know, so if you pay off the people, you know, it's what it seemed like to me before it even happens. If you give all these grants out, people aren't going to push back enough to make affect change. So we need to get in there first and do education ahead of time to have people understand what was even at stake. But that leads me to something else that really I think is another key is we're 5, 10, 20 years behind. They come up with these plans. We don't know what's happening. We got to scramble. We need to quit scrambling. We got to get up to speed. We need to have people doing research and letting communities know what's coming, what's likely to come in the world of biogas or biomass or some other electric energy technology, so that communities are aware and can like build up resistance and activism ahead of time before they even show up. So in education, because I hate being 20 years behind and 10 years behind. I don't like not knowing. And so that's one of the things we're working on, is to try to, you know, understand all the methods of biomass and electricity and how does that work together. So
Thank you.
Yep.
So the message is be proactive as much as you can, not reactive, and put your money where your mouth is, as Kelsey said. So with that, I'm going to thank all our panelists for this discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Savannah to wrap up.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists, to our moderator, Dr. Tina Liu, and for a dynamic cross-border conversation on climate change and environmental justice. And I think Kelsey and Natalia and Jeff, in their remarks, they really set us up quite well for our next panel, our second panel that we're going to have in our event series. Kelsey talked about that art is how you communicate science, and Natalia talked about the power of storytelling and climate change. And so our second conversation, which is going to be on Monday, November 15th at 2 p.m., will be on featuring 6 amazing Indigenous artists and talking about Indigenous art's representation of climate change. So, and how they tell stories through, of what's happening. So I encourage all of our panelists and our attendees to join that conversation. I'm going to quickly throw in the link to register for that event that's happening again on Monday, November 15th. So we hope to see you all there. And I just want to say once again, thank you for a fantastic conversation.